Picture a quiet, sunny day in the park. People are strolling, birds are singing, and nothing seems to be going wrong. But suddenly, the silence is broken by a shocking scene. A police officer, filled with hatred, walks up to an elderly black woman sitting quietly on a bench, and hits her. All this happens right before your eyes. But here's the surprise: when her son arrives at the scene, something changes. You see fear and uncertainty flash in the eyes of those who had just demonstrated force. What do you think happens next? Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We are always interested to know about you, because each of you is incredibly important to us. Your comments help promote our channel and bring such important topics to the surface. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. You are our strength, and it is because of you that we can continue to tell the truth. Please do not forget that your likes, comments and subscriptions are what make us stronger. Enjoy watching. It was early morning and the park was just beginning to fill up with people. A light breeze played with the leaves, making them rustle. An elderly black woman, Mrs. Harper, sat on an old wooden bench by the lake. She liked to come here in the mornings. It was peaceful here, and nature gave her some privacy. Her face was tired, but reserved. She always kept within herself the strength that life had taught her to hide from the world. She was sitting reading a book, lost in her thoughts, when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see a white policeman in uniform slowly approaching her. His face was coldly hostile, his lips were compressed, his gaze heavy, as if he had already judged her for something. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, stopping in front of her. His voice sounded like an order, as if he was already expecting her to justify the very fact of her presence here. Mrs. Harper was an experienced woman. She knew that such conversations never ended well for people like her. But she, too, was too proud to simply remain silent. She slowly closed the book, looked at him, and answered calmly, "I'm sitting here, like every day. This is a park, and it's for everyone." The policeman winced at her answer. His gaze became even colder. He didn't like that she dared to talk to him as an equal. He looked around as if expecting support from the outside, although there was no one nearby who could help him or intervene. "For everyone? For people like you?" His voice grew sharper. He took a step closer, and the air grew tense, like before a storm. "I said, what are you doing here? Are you doing something suspicious?" Mrs. Harper could respond. The policeman snatched the book from her hands and threw it to the ground. She screamed in surprise, but before she could say anything, he grabbed her arm and jerked her off the bench. "I know people like you," he hissed angrily. "Do you think you have the right to be here, among normal people?" Mrs. Harper struggled to free herself. Her face twisted in pain as the policeman squeezed her frail arm even tighter. She looked at him, her eyes full of fear, but she couldn't give him the satisfaction he sought. "Please let me go," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I didn't do anything." But the policeman wasn't listening. His face was red with rage, and his hand tightened even more. Suddenly, without warning, he punched her in the face. The sound of the blow echoed around the empty park. Mrs. Harper fell to the ground, her glasses flying off her face and shattering on the pavement. "This is for not listening," he shouted, standing over her. "You think you can just sit here like everyone else?" She pressed her hand to her face, feeling blood begin to seep from her split lip. Her body shook with pain, but fear of what might happen next was stronger. "Get up," the policeman ordered, tugging at her shoulder. "You're under arrest for disobedience." Mrs. Harper tried to stand up, but pain shot through her body and she fell again. Tears ran down her cheeks, mixing with the blood. There was only one thing in her mind: how could this happen to her here, in this peaceful place, among people who seemed to have forgotten what justice was? "Get up," his voice became more and more angry. "Or do you want more?" And then she heard someone scream behind her. The scream cut through the air like a knife, stopping the policeman in his tracks for a moment. It was the voice of a young man, full of rage and terror. Mrs. Harper could not see his face, but she knew the voice all too well. It was her son, Marcus. "Hey, leave her alone," he shouted, rushing towards his mother. His broad shoulders tensed, the muscles in his neck tightened, and his face contorted with anger. The policeman, taken aback by the sudden appearance, took a step back, but his expression immediately changed to a mocking grin. He lifted his chin, looking at Marcus with a challenge, like a predator who does not intend to give up his prey. "Who else are you?" he asked coldly. not letting go of Mrs. Harper's hand. "Another one of you?" Marcus ran up, and his eyes met his mother's. There was horror in them, horror at what had happened. She was sitting on the ground, blood running down her chin, her eyes full of pain and helplessness, but deep in her gaze, one thought flitted through her: stay away, Marcus. They'll do it to you, too. But her son was too angry, too full of adrenaline, to back down. He walked right up to the policeman, never taking his eyes off his face. "You think you can get away with this?" Marcus hissed, his hands shaking with tension. "That's my mother. How dare you touch her?" The policeman just smirked and slowly released Mrs. Harper's hand, throwing it to the ground like an unnecessary object. He took a step forward, right next to Marcus. Now they stood in front of each other, like two opponents, ready to rush into battle at any moment. "What are you going to do, huh?" the policeman asked sarcastically, looking Marcus straight in the eye. "Do you think your life means anything to the likes of me?" There was naked hatred in his voice, as if he didn't see a person in front of him, only an enemy. Marcus felt his anger boiling inside him, and he clenched his fists, but his mind fought against his emotions. He knew that if he hit him, it would only give the policeman an excuse to do something even worse. "You don't dare touch her," Marcus repeated, his voice shaking but full of determination. The policeman just laughed, his laughter sounding like a dull echo in the empty park. "I dare not," he said, cocking his head to the side as if considering his words. "You don't make the rules here, boy. I can do whatever I want." He made a sudden movement, grabbing Marcus by the lapels, but Marcus pulled away instantly. Silence hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if time had stopped. The policeman and Marcus stood opposite each other, their eyes fixed on each other, like animals before a fight. But suddenly everything changed. The policeman pulled out his baton and hit Marcus hard on the shoulder. He didn't have time to react, and the blow was so strong that his body moved. He almost fell. Pain shot through his arm, but he stayed on his feet, taking a step back. "This is what happens to those who don't know their place," the policeman said with a grin, raising his baton for another blow. But at that moment Mrs. Harper's voice cut through the air again. She tried to stand up, her body shaking with pain, but in her eyes there was fear, not for herself, but for her son. "Marcus, please, don't," she cried, her voice full of desperation. She knew that if Marcus started fighting, it would end badly. Marcus looked back at his mother, his heart breaking. He couldn't bring himself to hit the policeman. He couldn't do what he wanted, but the sight of his mother, hurt and scared, filled his mind with horror and pain. One thing pounded in his head: what will they do to us? What will they do to her? The policeman swung again, but at that moment he heard footsteps in the distance. It was another police patrol approaching the scene. The second policeman's footsteps were getting closer, echoing across the empty park, but the one standing over Mrs. Harper and Marcus was not going to stop. His eyes were blazing with wild anger, as if the presence of his colleague only added fuel to the fire. In his head, it seemed, a scenario was playing out where he had already won, where nothing could stop his sadistic joy. "Now you're caught," he hissed, squeezing the club even tighter. His movements became faster, more decisive, as if he felt that he had little time left for entertainment. He turned to Mrs. Harper, who was still sitting on the ground, her body bent in pain. Marcus, gritting his teeth in frustration, rushed forward to shield her with his body. The policeman stepped sideways, around him, and brought his baton down hard on the old woman's back. Mrs. Harper's scream filled the park, piercing its deathly silence. It was a scream of horror, pain, and despair, and it echoed throughout Marcus's body. He lost control. The feeling of helplessness turned to rage, and he lunged at the policeman, trying to push him away from his mother. "You're a bastard," Marcus shouted, punching the policeman in the chest, causing him to take a few steps back. The policeman staggered, but his expression remained cruel. He was not going to back down. Instead, something darker, something animalistic, blazed in his eyes. He swung his baton furiously and struck Marcus in the side. The blow was hard, painful, and Marcus fell to the ground next to his mother, clutching his ribs. "You've just made your biggest mistake," the policeman said coldly, coming closer. "Now I'm going to deal with both of you." He raised his club, preparing to deliver another blow to Marcus's head. Mrs. Harper, barely breathing, tried to pull herself toward her son, her shaking hands reaching out for him, but the pain was too great. It took all her strength to stay conscious. "Please," she breathed out, her voice almost inaudible. "Stop, please." But the policeman was possessed. He didn't care. He raised his baton even higher, enjoying the moment, feeling all-powerful. At that moment, another officer appeared from behind the trees, the second policeman, the one whose footsteps they had heard earlier. His face was completely confused. He clearly had not expected to see such a scene. He immediately assessed the situation. One of them was standing over the woman and the young man lying on the ground, raising his baton, preparing to deliver another blow. "Hey, stop! What are you doing?" the new policeman shouted, quickening his steps. The racist policeman froze for a moment, but did not let go of his baton. His face twisted in rage, and he turned to his colleague. "It's none of your business," he shouted, waving his hand as if trying to brush him off. They resisted. They deserved it. The second policeman slowed down, not understanding what was happening. He saw two wounded people in front of him, one of them an elderly woman, and he was faced with a question he clearly did not want to ask. Why was his partner so carried away by the beating? "What are you talking about?" The second policeman frowned, his hands reaching for his belt. "For the radio. Are you crazy? Stop. Right now. We're at work, not in a movie about bandits." But the racist cop didn't hear any of it anymore. His eyes were filled with dark fury. His hatred for the people in front of him consumed him. He turned back to Marcus, swinging his baton, clearly intent on finishing what he had started. "I'm warning you," the new officer shouted, taking out his taser and pointing it at his colleague. "Stop, or I'll use force." But it was all happening too fast. The racist cop raised his hand again to strike, his breathing quickening like a predator ready for the final attack. There was no logic in his head anymore, only the desire to destroy, to punish. Marcus, lying on the ground, looked up in horror, realizing that the blow was already inevitable. And then, in an instant, the second officer fired his taser. The shock hit his colleague's body and he jerked like a puppet on strings, dropping his baton, his face contorted in shock, and within seconds he collapsed to the ground, his body shaking in pain. There was a heavy silence, the heavy breathing of Mrs. Harper and Marcus was the only sound in the empty park. The second policeman slowly walked over to his partner, who was now lying motionless, then leaned over and handcuffed him, his face a mixture of horror and disgust. "It's over," he whispered, looking at his fallen colleague. "It's over." The racist policeman, still lying on the ground, was shaking from the electric shock, but his eyes still burned with hatred. He quickly recovered, grabbing his baton by the belt, jumping to his feet again. Rage overwhelmed him, and when he stood up, his face became even more sullen and cruel. "You will answer for this," he shouted, turning to his colleague, who stood with a stun gun in his hands, ready to use force again. Mrs. Harper, still lying on the ground, tried to rise, her weak body shaking with pain. She knew she had to get up, had to protect her son, but every cell in her body resisted, as if life itself was trying to escape from her old self. She saw their world crumbling, the fear growing, and the hatred creeping towards them with every step. "Don't you dare go near her," Marcus shouted as he saw the policeman heading towards his mother again. His voice was full of rage and defense, but inside him there was a terrible premonition. "I'm not going to touch her," the racist cop replied with a cold grin. "I'm just going to show you what it means to disobey." He suddenly turned towards Marcus and punched him in the stomach, causing him to double over in pain. "Have you forgotten where your place is?" the policeman continued, chuckling with malice. "You have no right to protect anyone." Marcus fell to his knees, unable to breathe, his eyes filling with tears. He didn't understand how this was possible, how hate could destroy lives so mercilessly. He felt helpless like never before. In that moment, it seemed as if the entire system was against him, against his family, against life itself. The racist cop wouldn't leave him alone. He raised his foot and hit Marcus hard in the back, sending him falling to the ground again. Each blow was like a hammer, crushing his hopes, crushing his soul. "You're just a black guy," he taunted, raising his hand to hit her again. "I can do whatever I want with you." Hearing her son's screams, Mrs. Harper gathered her last strength and, leaning on her hand, tried to stand up. She understood that if she did not stop this violence, they would lose each other. Every drop of blood, every cry of her son tore her heart. "Leave him alone," she screamed, her voice full of pain and despair. Please stop. The policeman turned to face her, his eyes gleaming with anger, and he came towards her again, his hand outstretched to strike. Do you think I'm afraid of you? He said, raising his hand to strike. You're nothing, old witch. His fist landed on her face with such force that she lost consciousness for a few seconds. Mrs. Harper felt the world around her go dark, her body becoming heavy and uncontrollable. She wanted it to end, but deep down she knew she had to fight, had to stay conscious for her son. Marcus, trying to get up, saw his mother fall to the ground again. His heart was torn apart by pain and rage was blazing inside him. He, suffering from each blow, rose despite the severe pain in his stomach. I won't let you touch her, he shouted, clenching his fists. There was such desperation in his voice that even the policeman froze for a moment, not expecting such determination. You can't do anything about it, the policeman exclaimed, turning back to Marcus, his face filled with disdain. I'll break you. Marcus lunged forward, gathering his last strength, and using all his weight, he hit the policeman in the face. The blow was unexpected, and the policeman took a step back, his face distorted in shock. You'll pay for this, he hissed, rubbing his face before lunging at Marcus again. At that moment, the second cop who had taken the stand stepped forward. He saw his partner about to strike again and, without thinking, aimed his taser at the racist cop, but his hand was again knocked away. The situation escalated to the limit, and fear filled the air like darkness before a storm. You can't stop me, the policeman shouted, heading again towards Marcus, who was trying to get up, shaking in pain. At that moment, the sounds of sirens were heard from afar. It was help, but would it be on time? Sirens sounded in the distance, but time seemed to stand still in the park. The racist cop turned back to Mrs. Harper, anger, hatred, and cruelty reflected in his eyes. He stepped toward her like a predator, ready for anything, his shadow falling across her limp body. Do you still think you can stop me? He said, leaning over her, his voice full of contempt. You're just an old woman, and you're nothing in this world. With that he punched her in the face, his fist hitting her with such force that her head flew off. The blow was so strong that her lips were torn apart and blood ran down her chin. She closed her eyes in pain, trying not to lose consciousness, but the world around her was gradually plunging into darkness. No! Marcus screamed, trying to get up from the ground. His body wouldn't obey, but his spirit was unbreakable. He saw his mother suffer, and it made him so angry that he felt like he was ready to fight the whole world. The racist cop continued to beat her, as if in a trance, each blow of his fist echoing in the air like thunder. He struck hungrily, as if this was his last battle, and every movement made him feel his power over her. How do you like that? He shouted, hitting her stomach again and again. Each time he hit, it felt like the world around them was crumbling. Mrs. Harper cringed in pain, her breathing became ragged, and tears began to form in her eyes. With each blow she lost hope, but deep down there was still something that wouldn't let her give in. She thought about Marcus, how he shouldn't see her like this. She knew she had to stay strong, no matter how hard it was. You can't protect her, the policeman said again, turning to Marcus, who was still trying to get up. You're worthless. You have no right to protect yourself. Marcus, still on his knees, clutched the ground, his hands shaking with rage and pain. Every blow to his mother echoed in his heart, as if he himself were the one suffering. I won't let you touch her, he screamed, clenching his fists. At that moment, he felt his body fill with strength, as if the earth itself was supporting him. The policeman, seeing that Marcus was trying to get up again, swung again. He stepped back, preparing for the final blow, but suddenly he heard the sound of sirens, which were getting louder and closer. It was salvation, but he was not going to retreat. I'm not finished with you, he shouted, raising his club for the final blow. But at that moment the second policeman, who had been hesitating all this time, realized that the situation was out of control. He rushed to his partner, trying to stop him, but the latter was beside himself with rage. Get out of the way, the racist shouted, swinging at the second officer, not noticing that he himself was becoming increasingly aggressive. At that moment, as the air filled with fear and tension, other people appeared in the park. Hearing the screams and sirens, people began to gather around, their faces expressing shock and anger. This is crazy, one witness shouted, pulling out his phone to record what was happening. You can't treat people like that, The woman screamed from the side, her voice full of horror. The police, who were few in number, began to converge on the scene. Some of them did not know what had happened, but they saw one policeman beating a woman and her son. A strong hatred for this abnormal behavior began to spread through the crowd. The racist cop, aware that attention was focused on him, felt the tension building, but hatred and anger consumed him. He looked back at Mrs. Harper, who lay on the ground, her face covered in blood, her breathing barely audible. "You will remain in this position forever," he said with a menacing grin, raising his hand again to strike. But at that moment, the sound of footsteps was heard. Another group of police officers was approaching. Their uniforms glinted in the sun, and they rushed towards the scene, noticing the chaos that was unfolding before them. "What's going on here?" one of them shouted, trying to understand the situation. The racist policeman, seeing his strength waning, did not know how to react. He looked at his colleagues in despair, realizing that he could no longer continue this cruelty. Everything around them was changing. Fear, anger and hatred were intertwined into one unbreakable thread, and no one knew how this story would end. The situation in the park was escalating. The racist cop, aware that attention was focused on him, turned sharply toward his approaching colleagues. His face was contorted with anger, and his eyes were burning with the desire for violence. He was not going to give in. He was not going to submit. He had power, and he intended to use it. "It's not what you think," he shouted, trying to justify himself to the new policeman, but his voice sounded hysterical. "They attacked us themselves." His words made no sense when the sounds of pain hung in the air. Mrs. Harper, clutching her stomach, fought every breath, her body shaking with pain. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her, why the hatred and aggression was pouring out on her. She had only wanted to spend time with her son in the park, and now she was a victim of madness. The racist cop came toward her again, his hand on his baton raised again. He looked at her with the same cruel smile, like a predator preparing to attack. "You should never have left the house, you old witch," he shouted, bringing the club down again, this time with more force than before. The blow landed on her back, and Mrs. Harper groaned as her body arched in pain. Blood gushed from her lips again, and the world around her went dark. She felt the darkness closing in on her, and with each passing second it became harder to fight the abyss. "You can survive this, Mom," Marcus screamed, unable to bear to watch his mother suffer any longer. His voice cut through the pain and rage, but he could not stop the violence that was unleashed before him. The policeman, aware that his actions were being observed, hit Mrs. Harper again, this time aiming for her face. The blow landed on her cheek, and she felt her jaw shift slightly. Her head snapped back again, and her eyes filled with tears of pain. She tried to stand up, but her body wouldn't obey. "Don't you dare get up," the policeman growled as she tried to rise again, and grabbed her by the hair and pulled her down sharply. Her head hit the ground again and she screamed in pain. At this point, the crowd of people gathered around began to realize what was happening. Their faces, initially full of curiosity, now showed anger and shock. Some pulled up their phones, recording what was happening, but many began to shout for Mrs. Harper and her son. "Stop, this is cruelty," a woman from the crowd screamed, her voice filled with complete horror. The racist cop, feeling the growing pressure from the crowd, turned back to Marcus, ready for the final blow. He stepped forward, as if deciding who to hit first, the mother or the son. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted, swinging again. "I'm in charge here." Marcus felt pain run through his body as he rose from the ground, but he was not going to give in. He knelt down, holding his stomach, but his gaze remained focused on the policeman. "You can't just beat us," he shouted, his voice a mixture of fear and determination. The policeman just grinned and, turning to the crowd, said, "Get your black people out of here. I'll drive you all out of here." His words flew through the air like poison, and the crowd, seeing the darkness looming over them, began to boil with rage. The policeman's hatred was infectious, and some of them even began to shout back, showing that they hated him. "This is our park. We won't let you behave like this," one of the men shouted, taking a step forward. But the policeman only chuckled, his aggression growing. He turned back to Mrs. Harper, this time with hatred. "You thought you could escape justice?" he said, and there was a sinister pleasure in his voice. You don't know what it's like to be in my place. He swung again, and his club met her stomach with such force that she lost consciousness for a few moments. When she opened her eyes, darkness still swirled around her, and the world was slowly turning into chaos. Screams, sirens, and fear filled the air. At that moment, a new generation of police officers, caught in this terrible situation, arrived on the scene, but they did not know what they would face. The situation was getting tense, and every moment was bringing them closer to stopping this madness. The racist cop, feeling trapped, no longer understood what was happening. He continued to hit Mrs. Harper, not noticing that his partners stopped, realizing that they could not watch this brutality, no matter how hard he tried to intimidate them. The racist policeman, feeling increasingly invulnerable, turned back to Mrs. Harper, who lay on the ground, her face and body covered in bruises and blows. Tears ran down her cheeks, mixing with the blood, and she tried to take a breath, but each time she felt a sharp pain pierce her chest. "You think you can just sit here and do nothing?" he growled hatefully, leaning towards her. His voice sounded like he was enjoying her suffering. "You and your ancestors should have realized that your days were numbered." With that, he hit her again, his fist landing in her stomach. She arched in pain, her breath hitching, and she bit her lip to keep from screaming. Each blow sent her deeper into the abyss, and thoughts of her family, her son, the life she had lived, flew away. Marcus felt rage building in his chest as he watched his mother suffer. Every blow to her body echoed in his soul, as if he were experiencing the violence himself. His eyes filled with tears, but he could not allow himself to give in. He knew he had to fight. He had to protect his mother, even if the odds were against him. "You have no right to touch her," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. He rose to his feet despite the pain and looked at the policeman with hatred that had ignited in his heart. The policeman, feeling challenged, turned to him with a grin, his face filled with malice, and he stepped toward Marcus. "You think you can stop me?" he said, as if insulting him. "You're just a boy who doesn't know his place." Marcus gathered all his strength and stepped forward to protect his mother. He was not going to give this monster a chance to continue his actions, his fists clenched, ready for one last effort. But the policeman, noticing his intention, suddenly lunged at him and hit him in the face. Marcus, feeling a sharp pain, fell to the ground. He tried to get up, but his head was spinning, and his body was betraying him again. At this point, conversations began to break out in the crowd. People watching the events were full of anger and indignation. Some tried to intervene, but were held back by the crowd. Some were already calling the police, but it was just a spectacle, and no one knew how it would end. "Take this off," one woman screamed, holding up her phone to record the horrific violence. "We have to stop this," the other man said, his voice shaking with fear and rage. The racist policeman, feeling the eyes on him, turned back to Mrs. Harper. She, weakening with each blow, tried to raise her hands, but did not have the strength. "You have to understand that you are worthless," he said, hitting her again in the face. Blood spurted out, and she closed her eyes again, feeling the world slipping away from under her feet. Marcus, lying on the ground, felt an emptiness in his heart. He could no longer watch his mother suffer. Hatred and anger filled his soul, and he, gathering his last strength, rose again. "I won't let you take her," he shouted, rushing forward, his fist hitting the policeman hard in the stomach. The blow was unexpected, and the policeman took a step back, startled. His face was contorted with rage, and he looked at Marcus with mad anger. "You will pay for this," he growled, swinging again. The crowd around him began to react. People began to shout, encouraging Marcus. Their voices filled the space, creating an atmosphere of unity against violence. "Don't give up," the woman screamed, holding the phone and recording every movement. But the policeman, losing his self-control, lunged at Mrs. Harper again, his hands squeezing her throat. She tried to break free, her eyes wide with fear, and she gasped again, feeling the world around her slipping away. "You have no right to live," he growled, his face distorted with hatred. Marcus, realizing his mother was in danger, rushed forward, terror raging inside him, and he pushed the policeman with determination. "Let her go!" he shouted, his voice sounding like a last hope. But the policeman only grinned, his hands continuing to squeeze the woman's throat. "You can't stop me," he said, his eyes burning with a thirst for power. "I'm the king here." But at that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps was heard. It was a new group of police officers who, having heard the screams and seen the situation, came to help. They separated the crowd, trying to intervene, but did not know what they would encounter. The racist cop, feeling his power slipping, suddenly released his grip, leaving Mrs. Harper on the floor, her breathing shallow, struggling to compose herself, her eyes filled with utter fear. The world around them changed. Hatred, aggression and fear intertwined, and every moment brought them closer to the denouement. Marcus, in shock at what was happening before his eyes, felt rage flare up inside him. His heart was pounding as if it was trying to escape from his chest, and his breathing was ragged from fear and helplessness. He saw the policeman beating his mother with hatred, and every second of fear turned into the realization of the need to act. He rose from the ground, his legs shaking with pain, but he could not allow himself to give in. Many thoughts raced through his mind about how to protect his mother, how to stop this violence. He began to make his way through the crowd, shouting, "Make it stop, please, someone, help!" But the crowd, divided by fear and hatred, could not bring itself to intervene. Some simply filmed everything on their phones, others shouted in support, but no one went into conflict with the police. Marcus knew he had to act. He walked around the crowd and, gathering his strength, rushed towards the policeman again. Hatred and determination flared up inside him. "Let go of my mother," he shouted, trying to intervene again. His voice grew louder with each word, filling the space with rage. The policeman, noticing Marcus approaching, turned and looked at him with contempt again. His expression suggested that he was ready to continue his madness, unaware of the anger building up around him. "You think you can stop me?" he said, his voice full of malice. "You are nothing." Marcus, ignoring the threats, stepped forward again. He felt something powerful rising inside him, a desire to protect his mother, to stop this abyss of cruelty. "Don't touch her," he shouted, and his fist hit the policeman hard, forcing him to take a step back. The screams of the people around him grew louder, and some began to come closer, encouraging Marcus. But the policeman, who had not expected the attack, quickly came to his senses and swung, his hand with the baton rising again. "You will pay for this," he growled, his face contorted with rage. At that moment, Marcus felt the adrenaline rush through his body. He realized that he could not allow this violence to continue, and he focused all his strength and stepped forward again, ready to fight. A crowd was gathering around them, and the anger of the people was beginning to coalesce into a single whole. The woman with the phone screamed, "We have to stop this. We can't just watch." Their screams reached a crescendo when the police officer swung at Marcus. At that moment, more police officers arriving on the scene finally noticed what was happening. They began to advance towards the conflict, their faces determined to stop the violence. "What's going on here?" one of the new cops shouted when he saw what was happening. The racist police officer, realizing that his actions were beginning to attract attention, suddenly stepped back, releasing Mrs. Harper and turning his gaze to his colleagues. "It's not what you think," he shouted, his voice filled with fear as the other officers approached. "They attacked us." Marcus, feeling the darkness that had surrounded his mother, finally began to lift, leaning toward her, unable to hold back his tears. "Mom, hold on, I'm with you," he whispered when she, exhausted and barely breathing, looked at him with hope. One of the new policemen, noticing Mrs. Harper's condition, quickly ran up to her and bent down. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Marcus watched as his mother struggled to catch her breath, and as he felt her hand shaking in his, he felt he couldn't leave her alone. "Help her, please," he cried, and his voice sounded like a plea. The crowd around them could no longer remain indifferent. People began to realize what had happened, and their anger at the racist police officer was turning into a desire for justice. Some began shouting words of support, demanding fair treatment and punishment for the person who had beaten the elderly woman so mercilessly. At that moment, It became clear that the situation had changed. This was no longer just a conflict between one police officer and two victims. This had become a protest against violence and racism that people were no longer going to tolerate. Marcus, still kneeling next to his mother, felt his heart breaking with horror and anger. He couldn't believe what had happened. He had no time to think, only a strong desire to protect his mother from this racist cop. As other police officers approached, he rose to his feet and felt his anger well up inside him. A crowd gathered around him and people began to unite, shouting for justice. "This has to stop," Marcus shouted to the crowd, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let this go on." The crowd supported him, and soon there were shouts of support. People began to huddle together, encouraging each other, creating an atmosphere of unity. Marcus realized that at that moment he was not alone. Those who also did not want to remain silent, those who were ready to fight for the truth, had gathered around him. The racist cop, feeling he was losing control of the situation, looked at his new colleagues who were starting to figure out what was going on. He knew his actions would now be under close scrutiny. "You don't understand anything," he growled, trying to justify himself. "She attacked me herself." But his words had no weight. One of the new police officers, a younger one, with an expression of anger on his face, approached the racist policeman and said, "You know this is wrong. We have to deal with this." Marcus, seeing his mother still lying on the ground, exhausted and beaten, returned to her again. He took her hand, trying to convey to her all his strength and love. "Mom, you're strong. You can get through this," he said, trying to sound confident, even despite his own fear. "I'm with you." Mrs. Harper opened her eyes with difficulty and looked at her son, her gaze filled with love and sadness at the same time. Her body was shaking, but a spark of hope appeared in her eyes. "Marcus, her voice was barely audible and she coughed. "Don't say anything, just hold on," Marcus interrupted, tears in his eyes. At this point, the crowd continued to grow and the shouts of the people grew louder. They demanded justice, demanded that the racist police officer be punished for his actions. Marcus felt his own strength increase with the support of those around him. He turned to the crowd and shouted, "We will not remain silent. This is unacceptable. We must unite against violence and hatred." His words inspired the people around him, and they began to shout back, raising their hands in solidarity. Each of them felt the need to defend their rights, their lives, and they were ready to fight for it. The racist cop, seeing that the situation was getting out of hand, tried to scare Marcus again, but his partners were beginning to realize that what was happening required attention. One of the new cops, still leaning towards Mrs. Harper, shouted, "We called an ambulance. You need to hold on. Everything will be fine." Marcus, hearing these words, felt a spark of hope ignite inside him. An ambulance might be able to help his mother. He looked at her, her face still scarred, but he knew she was not alone. They were together, and he would not let that monster touch her again. "They will answer for this. Mom," he whispered, hugging her. "We will achieve justice." The crowd continued to grow, and their shouts filled the air with energy. People began to exchange glances, and determination and unity appeared on faces. This was more than just a protest, it was a movement for justice and against racism. The policeman, realizing that his actions had backfired, began to panic. His confidence crumbled and he became restless as he watched his colleagues gather around. At that moment, the new policeman raised his voice and said, "We can't let this happen." Marcus felt the rage blazing inside him again. He knew his mother should not have to suffer because of hatred and prejudice. "We are together," he shouted at the crowd, raising his fist. "We will not let this stop us." His words brought a new wave of approval, and the crowd shouted back, creating a powerful, resonating roar. Everyone in that crowd understood that they were not there for just one woman, but for all who suffer injustice. Suddenly, sirens blared as an ambulance arrived on the scene. People parted to allow the paramedics to approach Mrs. Harper. Marcus watched as they quickly began to provide aid, covering her with a blanket and checking her condition. "It's going to be okay, Mom," he said as the medics got to work. "I'm with you. We'll get through this together." Despite the horror they had endured, hope was growing in his heart. He knew they were not alone, and that all these people around them would fight for what was right. This day was the beginning of something bigger, and he was ready to fight until the end. Marcus watched as the medics carefully covered his mother with a blanket, and his heart clenched with worry. She lay still, her face pale, and every breath she took was labored. He felt a lump in his throat, but he knew he couldn't afford to give in. "Mom, can you hear me?" he asked, leaning closer. "I'm here, we're together." At that moment, one of the medics, a young woman with a serious expression, approached them. She checked Mrs. Harper's pulse and nodded, reassuring him. "We'll take her. Everything will be fine," she said, leaning toward Marcus, "but we need you to back off and give us space." Marcus nodded stiffly and took a step back. He knew he had to trust the professionals, but he was still seething with rage. The racist cop stood nearby, his face twisted in fear and anger. He knew his actions were being recorded on the phones of the people around him, and that the consequences of this day could be terrible for him. "You'll pay for this," the racist cop growled at Marcus. "You don't even know who you're dealing with." Marcus felt hatred boiling inside him. He wasn't going to stay silent any longer. This cop couldn't leave them alone even now, when his mother needed help. "You have no right to threaten us," he shouted, raising his voice to be heard above the noise of the crowd. "You are the one who must answer for this." The crowd, sensing his determination, began to shout in support. People began to unite, their voices filling the space with anger and determination. They were ready to fight for justice, and Marcus became their voice. "We are here to stop this," he continued. "No violence can go unpunished." The ambulance had already begun to lift Mrs. Harper onto a stretcher. The paramedics worked quickly and professionally, but every moment seemed to drag on forever. Marcus felt his mother slipping away, and it filled him with dread. "We won't leave her," he shouted as they started to lead her to the car. "She's strong, and she'll get through this." At this moment, one of the police officers standing nearby turned to his colleagues. "We need to sort this situation up before it gets out of hand," he said, trying to calm the situation down. "An investigation is needed." The racist policeman looked at him with hatred, but his face betrayed fear. He knew that his actions would put him at risk. "It's not my fault," he cried, rubbing his fists as if looking for an excuse. "She started it." But no one in the room believed him. The crowd began shouting for justice. People began filming the scene, and that footage could prove his guilt. Marcus felt his heart break when he saw his mother being carried away. He ran after them, not wanting to leave her alone. "I'm with you, Mom," he shouted as the ambulance closed the doors. He knew he couldn't do more, but inside him, he was growing determined to stand up for the truth. The ambulance drove away, and Marcus remained in the crowd, his eyes full of tears. He knew he had to be her voice, that he couldn't let this cop get away with it. "We must go to court," someone from the crowd shouted. "We must get justice." Marcus turned to the people around him, and in that moment he realized that this was more than just one incident of violence. This was a movement, and he wanted to be a part of it. He began to gather his thoughts and think about how he could make sure this story was heard. "Let's start a petition," he suggested, turning to a group of people standing nearby. "We need everyone to know about this." They started talking about how to collect signatures, how to attract the attention of local media. People started talking about how important it is to unite to resist violence and racism. "We will fight," Marcus said, his voice filling with strength. "We will not let this go. We will get justice for Mom and for everyone who is suffering." The crowd began to support him, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. They knew that together they could change the world. "We will fight for her rights," they shouted, and this marked the beginning of a new era of struggle for justice. Marcus felt his heart fill with hope. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. He and his mother deserved better. The crowd gathered around the scene continued to grow, filled with determination and anger. Marcus, standing on a makeshift platform made from a box, shouted, "We must demand justice. This policeman cannot get away with his actions." People began to rise and nod, their faces expressing unity and support. They knew they had to act, and this desire moved within each of them. Meanwhile, the racist policeman, realizing that the situation was getting heated, quickly stepped aside. He began to catch the glances of his colleagues, trying to find protection in their faces, but their expressions were full of discontent. One of them, younger and more determined, approached him. "You can't just leave," he said. "You know what you've done." "I didn't do anything wrong," the policeman shouted, his voice panicked. "She attacked me herself. You all saw it." But the crowd didn't believe his words. One of those present, A middle-aged man with a look of anger on his face stepped forward. "We saw you beat up that woman. You think your badge will protect you from the consequences?" he growled, pointing at the policeman. The escalating situation attracted the attention of the local news. Journalists began to approach the scene, setting up cameras and microphones. Marcus sensed that this was his chance. He stepped forward to address the crowd and the cameras. "This isn't just my mother's story," he began, looking at the cameras. "This is a story about how people who shouldn't have to suffer are systematically oppressed. We're all here to say, enough!" Marcus' words resonated with people. His voice sounded like a mantra, filling the space with energy. He continued to talk about the importance of unity, the need to fight racism and police violence. The policeman, increasingly losing confidence, tried to leave the scene, but his colleagues finally realized that the situation could not be ignored. They began to gather, and one of them, older and more experienced, approached the racist policeman. "You must admit your guilt," he said with displeasure. "It was wrong, and you know it." By this point, the news crews had already begun interviewing witnesses. People were talking about what had happened, their voices filled with conviction. They were sharing their experiences, and this attracted more and more people. Soon there were not only calls for justice in the air, but also real action. Marcus, determined, began collecting signatures for a petition demanding an investigation into the police officers' actions. Every person who signed became part of this movement. People who didn't know each other became friends, united by a common goal. "We will get justice," Marcus shouted as the number of signatures grew. The situation was getting tense. The racist policeman finally realized that the pressure from the crowd and the journalists was growing. Suddenly, he felt panic creeping up on him. He began looking around restlessly, his face filled with fear. Fortunately, additional police forces and even representatives of local human rights organizations arrived shortly after. They approached the crowd, and one of the representatives, a woman with a determined face, began to speak. "We came to sort out the situation. We are here to make sure that justice is served." The crowd greeted her words with approval. They felt supported and their determination grew. "We demand that this policeman be suspended from duty," someone from the crowd shouted. "This violence is unacceptable." The human rights organization agreed to the people's demands and began recording information about the incident. They promised to organize a press conference to draw attention to the case. The racist policeman, seeing that his actions were now attracting attention, became increasingly unsure. His colleagues began to keep their distance, realizing that it would not be easy for them to justify themselves in this situation. Soon another policeman appeared and witnessed the incident. He walked towards the scene, his face clearly expressing displeasure. "What's going on here?" he asked, surveying the situation. "This police officer beat up an elderly woman and we demand justice," Marcus shouted, pointing at the racist. "He must answer for his actions." The situation escalated. The new policeman quickly approached the racist and began asking him questions. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice stern. At this point, as shock took hold of the scene, one of the senior police officers approached Marcus and shouted, "Remove this policeman from the scene." People cheered as the racist cop began to lose control. He was finally removed and watched in disbelief as his colleagues led him away, realizing his actions had been caught on camera and were now the subject of an investigation. As he was led away, the crowd chanted, "Justice! Justice!" Marcus felt a glimmer of hope in his chest. He knew their fight wasn't over, but this was an important step forward. They were each part of something bigger, and their voices were being heard. In the days that followed, an official investigation began, and stories of people who had witnessed the violence spread quickly on social media. Journalists covered the situation, and public support grew. A few weeks later, when the case went to trial, all eyes were on the courtroom. People had gathered to watch the trial. Marcus, holding a photo of his mother, prayed for justice. He knew this was more than just a case of abuse. This was an opportunity to change the system. Ultimately, the court found the racist police officer guilty of abuse of power and violence. It was a historic decision that inspired people across the country. The city that once witnessed a horrific act of violence has now become a symbol of the fight for human rights and justice. Marcus, though bitter about his experiences, knew that his mother and his struggle were part of something bigger. Together, he and others showed that silence was not an option, that every voice counts, and that justice can be done. The trial of the racist police officer became a landmark event for the entire country. More and more people came to support the victim of violence. Mrs. Harper and human rights organizations joined the trial. Marcus was in the courtroom every day, his heart beating faster with excitement and hope. At the trial, the prosecutor presented compelling evidence, video footage, eyewitness accounts, and medical reports. Every witness who took the stand described how a police officer had beaten an elderly woman. The crowd outside the court chanted, "Justice, and we will not forget. We will not forgive." The racist police officer sat in the courtroom, his face pale and his eyes full of fear. He knew the odds were stacked against him. His lawyer, trying to defend him, argued that his actions were justified, that he had acted in self-defense, but the judge and jury didn't buy it. The situation grew more tense with each passing day in the courtroom. Finally, after weeks of hearings, the court returned with a decision. "We find the defendant guilty of abuse of power and cruelty," the judge said, his voice firm. Shouts of joy echoed through the courtroom. Marcus, clutching a photo of his mother, felt tears welling up in his eyes. This was not just an admission of guilt by a police officer. It was a victory that united people in the fight against violence and racism. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years of imprisonment in a correctional facility. The judge continued. He will also be deprived of the right to work in law enforcement agencies. The racist cop shook his head in disbelief, his face contorted with anger and fear. He knew his life was now changed forever. Life in prison. When the policeman was taken away to prison, he was in shock. He had been transferred to a facility known for its high security and high levels of violence. The first few days were a real challenge. He wasn't just an ordinary prisoner, he was a former police officer, and that meant he was viewed differently. He faced disapproving looks in prison, and many inmates knew who he was. His status caused resentment among other inmates, especially those who had suffered police violence themselves. The first time he found himself in a common cell, he was insulted and threatened. "You thought you could beat people up, now look at you," one of the prisoners shouted, standing in front of him, his face full of anger. The policeman tried to ignore it, but soon realized that he had no one to talk to. He became the object of ridicule and hatred. Prisoners often gathered around him, shouting insults and making fun of him. Every night, when he lay down to sleep on the narrow bunk, he was tormented by the thought of what he had done. He saw images of the old woman he had beaten, her suffering, her son, who looked at him with bitterness. These thoughts did not give him peace. In the first months, he tried to prove himself as a strong prisoner, but this only made his situation worse. Soon his life became unbearable. He was often attacked, isolated from other prisoners. Rumors began to circulate that he was collaborating with the police, which added fuel to the fire. The policeman spent a lot of time reflecting on his life. He realized that he had become a victim of his own cruelty. Every blow he dealt to others now came back to him. In prison, he had no privileges, no friends. He was alone and vulnerable. His days were spent in agony. He sat in his cell, looking out the window as other prisoners passed by, going about their business. He heard their conversations, their laughter, and he knew that he would not be part of this world. He had become an object of hatred, and every day he had to fight for his survival. There was a lot of violence in prison, and unfortunately, he became part of that system. His life became one of survival and constant suffering. He learned to sidestep conflict situations, but still sometimes faced the violence that seemed inevitable in that place. Over time, he became more withdrawn. His anger and hatred turned against him. He began to think about his actions, about what it was like to be a victim. He was deprived of freedom, and this realization sometimes made him cry alone, when no one could see him. Gradually, the racist cop began to realize that his actions had terrible consequences not only for others, but for himself as well. Every day in prison became a reminder of what he had lost. This was his new reality, prison, where he had to pay for his actions. Eventually, he realized that his evil deeds could not go unpunished. He began to consider the possibility of reform. It was difficult, and he knew the road to redemption would be long and arduous, but perhaps he could do some good. Even while in prison, he began participating in rehabilitation programs to try to understand the reasons for his behavior. He also witnessed changes in other prisoners who were also looking for a path to correction. At some point, he realized that he had a chance to start over, although it was difficult. With each day he spent in prison, he He tried to learn from his mistakes. The policeman began writing letters in which he shared his thoughts and experiences, and soon they became part of a program for psychotherapy for prisoners. He wanted his story to be a warning to others. Life in prison was hard, but it also opened his eyes to reality. He realized that his actions were wrong, and now he had to find a way to redeem himself. Even if it seemed impossible, he was determined to change his life, even if it meant facing his own fears and inner demons. Despite all the difficulties the racist cop faced in prison, his long-held beliefs, the distorted sense of superiority he had nurtured throughout his career, remained alive in his mind. Even in the harsh realities of incarceration, where he faced the consequences of his actions every day, he still found ways to justify his behavior. Immersion in one's own thoughts. As he lay in his cell, the silence and darkness surrounding him, thoughts crept into his mind that he tried to suppress. Despite the condemnation and hatred directed at him, he still believed that black people should not be around him. In his warped view of the world, they were to blame for what was happening in society. This belief exerted power over him, and he could not shake the feeling that he was defending his rights and norms. They don't understand what it's like, he thought, clenching his fists as the other prisoners laughed and shared their stories. They brought their own troubles on themselves. All I did was try to keep order. These thoughts became more and more persistent, like a devilish whisper creeping into his mind. He tried to justify his actions, even when he knew they were wrong. Every time he saw a black prisoner, he felt the same hatred that had once given him strength on the street. Isolation and defense of one's beliefs. Even though he knew his beliefs were deeply rooted, he didn't want to change. He didn't seek forgiveness. Instead, he dug deeper into his stereotypes, trying to strengthen his identity. He continued to think that black people were a threat, both in life and in prison. When another inmate tried to talk to him, the policeman interrupted him, becoming aggressive. "Do you think I'll listen to you?" he said, having heard enough of the insults from the others. "You're no better than those I hate." His words sounded angry, but they were a true reflection of his thoughts. He did not want his beliefs to be challenged. Even in such a dark place as prison, he sought justification for his hatred, and found it in his stubborn refusal to change his view of the world. Conflict with oneself. Gradually, the internal conflict began to mount. He felt that his convictions were becoming increasingly fragile, especially when he saw other prisoners sincerely trying to change their lives. Every time he heard someone share their experiences, talk about how they managed to overcome difficulties, he felt jealousy and anger. "They're just pretending," he thought, gritting his teeth. "Nobody can be that good." But deep down, amidst all the hatred and aggression, insecurity was beginning to stir. He felt like his beliefs weren't being tested, and it filled him with fear. Fear of losing control of his identity. Fear that maybe he was wrong. This struggle within him continued. Every time he tried to cover up his hatred, he found it weakened. He couldn't allow himself to admit it. His prejudices were part of who he was. A period of self-reflection. In the silence of the night, as he lay on his narrow bunk, he began to remember his life before prison, a time when his life had seemed simple and understandable. He often recalled how he felt like a defender of order, how sure he was of his rightness when he beat up people he considered enemies. But now these memories, intertwined with loneliness and pain, became his prison chains. Maybe if I just... His thoughts always stopped there, as if he was afraid to finish the sentence. He couldn't admit that maybe his views were wrong, and that added even more self-loathing to his thoughts. But even in his loneliness, he continued to cling to his old beliefs. They served as a protective shield for him, and he was not ready to throw it off. He simply could not understand that there could be another truth, and that this truth could eclipse everything he had ever known. The internal conflict was growing like a storm, and he knew that one day he would have to choose, leave his prejudices behind or plunge into the abyss of hatred. With each passing day in prison, the racist cop's internal conflict became more and more unbearable. He began to realize that his hatred and prejudice had not only ruined the lives of others, but had also led him to this horrible place of pain and fear. He was tired of living in an atmosphere of hatred and isolation. The turning point. One day, during group therapy, he found himself face to face with a man he had once considered an enemy. This inmate, black and deeply scarred, was sharing his story. He told of how he had been wrongfully accused of a crime, how his life had been ruined by prejudice, and how he had fought for justice despite all odds. "I was so full of hate," he admitted, "but in the end, Hate doesn't solve problems, it only eats us up from the inside. The man's words came as a bolt from the blue. The racist cop suddenly realized that his own hatred and the beliefs he had defended for so long had brought him nothing but suffering. He saw how the destruction he had inflicted on others was now being turned against him. This moment of realization was a turning point for him. Search for redemption. From that day on, he began to change. He became actively involved in rehabilitation programs, consciously listening to the stories of other prisoners and beginning to understand their suffering. He slowly opened up, learned to admit his mistakes and see people beyond their race. He understood that everyone has a right to their own story and dignity. Unexpectedly for himself, he began writing. He started a journal where he shared his thoughts, fears, and, ultimately, his determination to become a better person. He knew that correction would take time, but he wanted to start with himself. He wanted to change his consciousness and, perhaps, help others who were in a similar situation. Justice has been served. Time passed, and the date of his release arrived. He left prison not just as a convict, but as a man who had undergone an internal transformation. He took with him a journal, which became a symbol of his change, and a decision that he would never again allow hatred to rule his life. Harper's son Marcus continued his fight for justice. He became an activist, advocating for black rights and police reform. He soon learned of how the police officer who had beaten his mother had changed and was now seeking redemption. Marcus was shocked, but also wary. He could not forget the trauma this man had inflicted on his family. Still, he had a desire to hear the story. At a meeting of a human rights group where the policeman was speaking, he decided to attend. The entire room held its breath as the policeman, now a man committed to change, began to talk about his journey to redemption. "I was stupid and cruel. I didn't understand what it meant to be human," he began. "I lost everything I had, but now I see that hatred doesn't solve anything. I'm here to learn, to change, and to help others who might think the same way I once did." The officer's words touched many in the room, including Marcus. He realized that this man had gone through something he himself could not bear, the realization of his own mistakes and the desire to change. Conclusion and hope. Despite all the pain the officer had caused his mother and others, he now tried to use his experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. Marcus saw an opportunity for redemption, not just for the officer, but for himself. It was the beginning of a new era, an era where bias could be spoken about openly and work to eradicate it. They started working together at a human rights organization to educate people, share stories, and combat bias. It was a tough road, but they both knew it was important. Together, they began a new chapter based on forgiveness, understanding, and a desire to change the world for the better. Justice was served, not only in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who could see that even in the darkest moments, light can be born. The story of a police officer who went from hatred to redemption has ended, but its lessons remain alive. The path to forgiveness and understanding was long and difficult, but it became possible thanks to a sincere desire to change oneself and help others. Marcus and a former police officer joined forces to create a space for dialogue where people could share their stories and fight prejudice. They knew that to build a better society, we need to learn from mistakes, understand each other, and forgive. It wasn't always an easy path, but together they proved that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found. Together, they worked to change consciousness, hoping that their experiences would help others avoid such hatred and cruelty. So, ultimately, their story became a symbol of hope and unity, demonstrating that justice can prevail and forgiveness is a powerful tool for healing. And, if you like this story, please write in the comments what you think about it. Have you ever encountered racism in your life? It is important for us to hear your stories and opinions, because each of you is very valuable to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it so you don't miss new inspiring stories. We appreciate each of you and wish you a wonderful day.